My friends, Ukraine is set to soon launch its much-awaited spring offensive, and they announced it pretty publicly. D-Day is believed to be set for late March, or early April, or perhaps a bit later. But thing is, it might fail, or at least delayed and postponed. The idea is to launch a counteroffensive to break the siege of Bakhmut before the city falls, and activate a new front in the south by launching a nearly simultaneous offensive towards Crimea through an armored assault in Zaporizhzhia Oblast, towards Melitopol and perhaps Berdyansk, in order to push to the Sea of Azov, coupled with an amphibious landing across the Dnieper from Kherson. I know that these big blue arrow offensives is a turn on for some, but is this plan realistic?
No.
Throughout the winter, while the Russians were battering the walls of Bakhmut, the Ukrainian army received hundreds of armored vehicles from the west, and Ukrainian troops actively trained on these recently delivered NATO-grade equipment, like these M2 Bradleys you can see on screen. These infantry fighting vehicles will advance towards Russian lines protected by dozens of Leopard 2s that will act like a steel fist to punch through enemy defenses. On top of that, some reports claim that Ukraine has been able to train up to 200,000 reservists during the winter. Yet it remains unclear how many of them would be fit for this spring offensive, since many of these reservists are simply sent to the front to replace casualties. In this article from the Washington Post that went viral, we're presented with Kupol, a lieutenant colonel of the 46th Air Assault Brigade. He said his battalion is unrecognizable. Of about 500 soldiers, roughly 100 were KIA and another 400 wounded, leading to a complete turnover. Kupol said, "I get 100 new soldiers. They don't give me any time to prepare them. They say take them into the battle. They just drop everything and run. That's it." And for his honest interview, Kupol was immediately demoted from the command of his battalion and labeled as a traitor. Meanwhile, the Asia Times reported a similar story for another unit. One Ukrainian battalion lost 600 men in January, received 700 replacements, and lost 800 men in February, a 60% casualty rate over 2 months. But as you can imagine, the coming offensive is no secret. Here from the National Post, Ukraine says Russia's Bakhmut assault loses steam. Counterstrike coming soon. Now our beloved CNN. Ukraine eyes an offensive around Bakhmut as Russian momentum stalls. And that is the entire problem. Everybody knows about it. Even the Uber Eats delivery guy told me that Ukraine is waiting for the end of the rain season and mud to launch their counteroffensive against Bakhmut. Same thing happened while I was working out in Dubai. I was debating with some gym bro at the cable machine on whether Ukrainians would attack towards Crimea or towards Bakhmut. Because despite all the copium from the mainstream media, the Russians keep pushing their way into the city and control around 65% of the urban area. Meanwhile, Ukrainians are actively preventing Russian forces from encircling this insignificant city. They're launching a lot of counterattacks, like in this video, where you can see the assault of the Ukrainian 110th Separate Mechanized Brigade, attacking Russian positions with many YPR 675 armored vehicles, somewhere near Bakhmut, most likely to the southeast near Ivanivske. Now let's be honest, the reason we're talking about this is because Ukraine still has nostalgia from its fall offensive. We all remember Ukraine's offensive in September 2022, how they broke through Kharkiv Oblast and swept everything in their way within a few days, chasing down fleeing Russian columns, raising their banner from one village after another, liberating Izium and Kupiansk and reconquering huge swaths of land. And this is what Ukraine is trying to repeat in 2023. However, since then, the situation on the front has drastically evolved. The Russian army has grown tremendously in size after calling up 300,000 mobilized personnel, plus about 50,000 from Wagner's recruitment campaigns, as well as thousands of volunteers. Russian propaganda mentioned this 32-year-old teacher from a Cossack military school that enlisted into the ranks with his former students. Or this 63-year-old man from Siberia who is said to have put aside the dumbbells and picked up a rifle. They also said that he asked his 85-year-old mother for permission to go to the front. All this additional manpower allowed the Russians to ditch the BTG structure and beef up already existing formations with hundreds of infantrymen to man every inch of the front. And all these units are pretty well equipped after Russia stepped up its military production. At the same time, Russia spent enormous resources to build a dense network of fortifications all along the front line to fend off enemy formations. In other words, Ukraine's spring offensive is not to be confused with spring break. It's not going to be a cakewalk because, number one, if Ukraine benefited from a nearly 5-to-1 advantage in manpower in the late summer 2022, the ratio of military personnel is now closer to parity, nearly 1-to-1. We already saw the effects of mobilization in Luhansk, where the Russian army managed to stall the Ukrainian offensive, and more specifically in Crimea, where Ukraine simply wasn't able to break through. Even worse, they got pushed back a little. Number two, Russia knows that Ukraine is about to attack, and that could explain why the Russian army's winter offensive was quite timid. Apart from Wagner's solo performance in Solidar and Bakhmut, the Russian armed forces only did little push here and there, but nothing major. And this leads me to believe that they wanted to preserve their forces for D-Day by increasing the density of military personnel everywhere along the front and making sure that every unit has enough ammunition. There remains many questions. When exactly is the counteroffensive of the armed forces of Ukraine going to begin? And where will the main strike take place? Number 3. Take a look at this map. Every red dot represents a geolocated Russian fortified position, and those are only the ones that could be mapped using satellite imagery. All this wasn't there in September. Notice how dense the defenses are on the Zaporizhzhia front line. We can see a first line of defense, followed by a second line, plus numerous additional entrenchments around strategic cities, and all along every major axis leading to the Sea of Azov. And that's without even taking into account the many possible minefields in the way. All these defensive structures were not there in Kharkiv Oblast when Ukraine launched its offensive, so the situation has drastically changed. Number 4. All the Ukrainian units trained for the specific purpose to march on Crimea were sent to hold the ego city of Bakhmut, exactly like the Russian High Command wanted. Prigozhin himself stated very bluntly that his forces are now facing the elite of the Ukrainian army: 80,000 military personnel, about 280 tanks, 1,000 armored vehicles, up to 300 pieces of artillery, as well as 93 MRLS systems concentrated in the area of Bakhmut, Konstantinivka, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, and Ruzhkovka. He said that with this grouping, the Ukrainian command will try to dislodge the PMC assault forces from Bakhmut and develop an offensive towards Donetsk. All this is not a complete surprise because I already told you about it in a previous video. Welcome to History Legends. Here are the latest news of the Russo-Ukrainian war. Remember that if you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. As you know, just like with many other commentators, some of my Ukraine updates have been targeted with limited or no ads. So make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal to keep the show running. Thank you to everyone that has already helped. And welcome to the headquarters. Now let's talk about how can Ukraine break this stalemate. Since they won't benefit from the effects of surprise or numerical advantage, there are two other ways we can think of. By creating an elite army corps, heavily drilled soldiers, possibly trained in the UK, Poland, or Germany, or by Western instructors. Equipped not with old Soviet equipment, but full NATO gear, like these 30 105mm AS-90 self-propelled howitzers pledged by the UK to Ukraine, or all these made in America M113 APCs, gun-mounted Humvees, and Bradley M2 fighting vehicles about to be used by the armed forces of Ukraine. Same thing for these Ukrainian paratroopers of the 80th and 82nd Air Assault Brigades, training on American Striker armored fighting vehicles somewhere in Germany. To me, this resembles what the German army did before its 1918 spring offensive. Each German regiment creamed off its best soldiers into stormtrooper units. Several complete divisions were formed from these elite units that underwent heavy specialized infantry training at the rear. Their goal was to break through, disrupt enemy headquarters, destroy artillery units and supply depots in the rear areas, as well as to occupy territory rapidly. And this is exactly what Ukraine wants to achieve. But instead of using a 100% infantry force like the Germans did, Ukraine will rely on a fast-moving, mobile armored component. And just like the Germans created new units, HistoryLegends released multiple articles on new Ukrainian units formed during the winter. They say the expansion of Ukrainian ground forces seems to be unstoppable, as new brigades are appearing literally every day. Just like the Germans in 1918, Ukrainians are providing extra training for already enlisted military personnel and training its stormtroopers in combined arms operations, that is, how to maneuver armored formations with close coordination with artillery and aerial units. In this article from the 5th of February, Ukraine creates offensive guard brigades. It is said, I quote, "In total, the Ministry of Internal Affairs is forming 8 assault brigades, and the volunteers can pick the brigade they want to serve in on the website." But when I looked at the name of all these new brigades, I sound strangely familiar to Lord of the Rings characters. I present you with your companions for this epic quest: Borevi, Karadag, Karvona Kalina, Spartan, Rubish, and of course, Azov. On the 21st of February, ground forces continue to expand with the 13th Yega Brigade, a new brigade specialized for forest and swampland areas, as well as the 22nd and 88th Mechanized Brigades. On the 24th of February, the 5th Assault Regiment is no longer a regiment, but has been reformed into a brigade, and will now be known as the 5th Separate Assault Brigade. One day later, on the 25th, the Ukraine Army has decided to form the new 37th and 38th Marine Brigade. The 38th Brigade is being formed on the basis of a well-known 503rd Marine Battalion. On the 15th of March, we get the 49th Artillery Brigade and the 82nd Air Assault Brigade, formed on the basis of the 87th Separate Air Mobile Battalion of the 80th Air Assault Brigade. And the last one on the 23rd of March. Kharkiv, originally created as a volunteer unit of the 127th Territorial Defense Brigade, has been reformed into a standalone brigade under the Offensive Guard program. I don't know about you, but I noticed a strange pattern in these new units. A lot of these new brigades were formed from battalions or regiments, which are significantly smaller core units. For example, they mentioned how the 38th Brigade would be formed out of the core from the 503rd Marine Battalion. A battalion is perhaps 20-25% of the size of the brigade, so where's the 75% remaining? Option 1. The core of these battalions will be made with actual combat veterans, and the rest will be filled up with volunteers from other units, aka highly motivated military personnel. Option 2 is that these brigades are only token brigades, to give the impression of big military formations, but in reality they would be much smaller in size. Anyway, now back to 1918. At first, the German army's offensive was successful. In late March, they wedged right at the junction of British and French armies, causing massive chaos. Their goal was to reach the sea and encircle the British forces. I don't know about you, but sounds familiar. Problem is, because of overuse and Allied artillery fire, the elite of the German army got wiped out within 2 months. And the German army never recovered. And the situation is even more comparable because the Allies and the Germans were almost at parity, 1-1. Now, the second way Ukraine is thinking of breaking this deadlock is by using new technology. We're talking about the new tanks, the Leopard 2s, the Challengers, the new infantry fighting vehicles, the HIMARS, but especially drones. Lots of drones. And as another historical example, this is very similar to the 1943 Battle of Kursk. In spring 1943, the German High Command believed that new weapons were the key to victory on the Eastern Front, namely with the Panther tank, the Ferdinand tank destroyer, and with more Tiger tanks on the front. So my boy H-Man decided to postpone the operation until the arrival of his new toys, thinking it would allow to compensate for the numerical advantage of the Soviets. And so the Germans prepared this attack for months. However, their preparations did not go unnoticed. Stalin, Zhukov, and even Nikolai, the postman from Vladivostok, knew about it. The Germans essentially had huge neon signs pointing towards Kursk. I will attack, but I will not tell you where. It would be an Überraschung, a surprise. So the Soviets cancelled all their offensive plans for 1943. They brought in massive reinforcements, gave every man a shovel, so they could dig in by building multiple lines of fortifications, countless anti-tank positions and anti-tank ditches, and just as many minefields. Everything in the book to wear out German armed formations. General Zhukov wanted to draw the elite of German forces into a trap where their armored power would be destroyed, thus creating the conditions for a major Soviet counteroffensive. Spoiler alert! Does this not remind you of what's going on now? And surprise, surprise! The Russians have brought in their brand new T-90M tank units closer to the front. Even more interesting, it was reported that Russian army forces sent reinforcements that took up positions on the northern and southern flanks of the Wagnerians, among which many paratrooper regiments known for their expertise in defense to sustain the shock of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. Vosniany kontranastop. The spring counteroffensive. Like we mentioned earlier, the big question is, where will the main thrust take place? To get the proper answer, we have to gather up all the clues. Meanwhile, another theory is that Ukraine is going to make heavy use of its Leopard 2 tanks for their general offensive. According to this other Forbes article, the Leopards will be attached to the 4th Ukrainian Tank Brigade. It says 40 tanks could equip one large battalion or 2 small ones. It would make logistical sense to assign all 40 Leopard 2A4s to the same brigade. They say that the 4th Tank Brigade is transitioning one of its battalions at the rear to be fully equipped with Leopard 2 tanks, while the other battalions are fighting near Bakhmut. Did you hear? Bakhmut! And using the deployment map, we can confirm that the 4th Tank Brigade is positioned somewhere west of Soledar. Clue number 2. Take a look at Ukraine's dwarf-named offensive brigades. Azov Brigade is positioned in Bilaura, Boryevi near Siversk, Spartan in Bakhmut, Rubizh near Chasiv Yar, and Chervona Kalina in Spirne. 5 out of the 6 offensive guard brigades are positioned around Bakhmut. As you can see, the Leopard Tank Battalion and all these offensive guard brigades are in a perfect position to flank Wagner's salient north of Bakhmut. Clue number 3. We can see that the highest concentration of Ukrainian artillery units is in Bakhmut, with namely 5 out of 12 artillery brigades deployed along the front, positioned around Bakhmut. That's basically 50% of all the artillery Ukraine has available. Now, the only problem related to this was revealed in this article from the BBC. No Ukrainian offensive without more weapons from Zelensky, where he claimed we're waiting for ammunition to arrive from our partners. You can have as much artillery as you want, but if you don't have ammunition, it's gonna be complicated. So if the Ukrainians are actively preparing an offensive, it would make sense to reduce the artillery consumption as of now to stack up as much as possible for D-Day. Clue number 4. The death of the 27-year-old famous commander of the 1st Mechanized Battalion with the call sign Da Vinci as part of the Ukrainian 67th Brigade. This brigade is one of the newest units created by Kyiv, formed in November 2022. And on Wikipedia we learn the following. The Ukrainian Volunteer Corps, or the paramilitary arm of right-wing Ukrainian Nationalist Party, was reformed as the 67th Separate Mechanized Brigade and were training in the United Kingdom. Videos surfaced on social media claiming that the 2nd Battalion of the 67th Brigade were honing in their anti-tank skills. And in this Twitter post, we learned that the British donated FV-103 Spartan reconnaissance vehicles made their appearance in a video from the Ukrainian 67th Mechanized Brigade. The video says, with a top speed of 60 miles per hour and room for 7, it's easy to see why Ukraine forces would covet that kind of armored mobility. Let's put all the pieces of the puzzle together. The 67th Mechanized Brigade, recently put together with highly motivated volunteers, trained in Britain, fully geared with British military equipment. This is clearly a unit meant for offensive operations. And once again, it is located near Bakhmut. However, instead of being kept in reserve for this big offensive, the 67th Brigade has already gone through the meat grinder. They lost a very good Da Vinci battalion commander, and on March 11th, on the Facebook page of the 67th Brigade, they posted the following. Friends, it's very hot here. Almost all the equipment is broken. We desperately need to purchase a large number of drones. It gets even more interesting if you check the edit history of the post, which says, friends, we have very large and serious losses, many KIA. But someone removed that line, so everything points towards an imminent Ukrainian offensive against Bakhmut. And this could explain why the Wagner PMC has stalled its own advance north of the city. to concentrate its forces in actually capturing the urban area of Bakhmut. I personally think that an amphibious assault across the Dnieper will not be the primary assault of the Ukrainian armed forces. Simply by looking at this map, we see that 4 out of 5 Ukrainian brigades deployed in Kherson are territorial defense units. These are second-rate units and they're ill-equipped for that task. They need a lot of boats and naval equipment. And even if they manage to cross over, they would have to face heavily fortified positions. All these territorial brigades can do is to pin down a number of Russian forces and prevent the transfer of reserves towards the Zaporizhzhia sector. Which leads us to this. One of the first hints is revealed to us in this Forbes article. The Ukrainian army is probing Russian lines in the south and suffering heavy losses. They say, I quote, "Many observers expect the counteroffensive to begin in Zaporizhzhia Oblast in southern Ukraine. A left hook from Zaporizhzhia driving south toward the Black Sea, then pivoting west towards the mouth of the Dnieper River, could cut the Russian army in two and position the Ukrainian army for an eventual liberation of the Crimean Peninsula." This task was given to the 128th Mountain Brigade, and by using the deployment map of military land, we can confirm the presence of this Mountain Brigade in the south, which has been escalating its recon operations with large-scale probes of Russian positions along the Zaporizhzhia front. Now, using Defense Politics Asia's map, we see that on the 15th of March, Ukraine forces did attack several positions out of the town of Kharkiv. We're talking about company-sized attacks, at most 100 men, supported by multiple armored fighting vehicles. We're talking about company-sized units, max 100 men, supported by multiple armored vehicles. But here you can see the results of these latest probing attacks. Meanwhile, Reddit, that is known to be very pro-Ukrainian, even admitted that these recon missions did not end well. The title says, "Filled with burning Ukrainian armor, MKA and wounded soldiers after a failed Ukrainian attack." You can clearly see the amount of destroyed vehicles and the surviving Ukrainian infantrymen laying flat in the open terrain. Same scenario in this video titled "More footage of yesterday's battle in the Zaporizhzhia region" from the observation post of the 291st Regiment of the Russian Armed Forces. As you can see, this is the problem with the southern front of Ukraine. It's pure flat terrain with barely any cover for the advancing infantry. Essentially, this seems very similar to the costly frontal attacks Ukrainians launched in Kherson Oblast. And this time there's no river or bridges to destroy to stall Russian logistics. Forbes revealed that apparently Ukrainian artillery was not able to suppress enemy guns, leaving the armored vehicles and their infantry fully exposed in the open terrain. And by analyzing this deployment map, I don't see the proper density of Ukrainian forces necessary to break through. With that being said, there are 2 Ukrainian tank brigades that could rapidly deploy to the main attack point a day prior to the offensive. Same goes with these 2 mechanized brigades. On top of that, if we return to the fortifications map, the strongest Russian defenses are positioned around Kharkiv. Look at everything they have to go through to get to Crimea. First, they have to break through the first 2 lines of defenses. Then they have to capture Tokmak and then Melitopol. It's going to be very complicated, especially if these Russian positions are heavily manned. The sectors of the front that are the least defended are here and here. And surprise, surprise, this is exactly where Ukraine launched its probing attacks on Russian positions. During their offensive, Ukrainian troops might take the path of least resistance and actually manage to break through in this sector that seems less defended. But it will also push them east and divert them from the main objectives they want to capture, and possibly lead them into a flight forward scenario straight towards a prepared fire bag. And what worries me is that it's not a surprise that the Russians launched their own probing attacks a few weeks ago against Kharkiv. They clearly knew that something was up and that something would start from there. Which leads me to believe that perhaps the Russian offensive against Vuhledar was meant to stall Ukrainian plans and cover the road leading directly towards Mariupol. Now, because the date and the location of the offensive is known, the general staff of the Ukrainian armed forces is preparing UAV shot companies for each brigade that will guide artillery fire. Entire flight schools have now been created to teach how to properly use reconnaissance and combat drones in order to inflict maximum damage during an attack. On top of reconnaissance drones, Ukraine is said to have bought 50,000 FPV drones from China. And they upgraded these commercial drones by attaching frag grenades or RPG-7s, with the intention to use these kamikaze drones to swarm Russian positions. Just like in this old Call of Duty, if you remember.
Zero. The stingers are our only chance.
The goal would be to overload enemy air defense capabilities, knock out headquarters, command centers, artillery pieces, and hunt down individual soldiers. This new tactic poses a real threat to the Russian army, because to counter it they need a large number of electronic warfare equipment to suppress all these communication channels, and put simply, the Russians don't have enough of them. Now imagine if the Ukrainians released 10,000 of these kamikaze drones on the first day of the offensive, and if only 1 in 5 reached their targets. We're still talking about 2,000 hits. So that's the situation on the southern front. That's all I have for you today. Let me know in the comment section what you thought of my analysis. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you want to support my work, make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal. The links are in the description below.